Comrade Hardy, dealing with trade and capitalism's wars, the socialist alternative.
Well, Mr. Chairman and comrades, before I get down to the subject in detail, it may help to get things in proper perspective if I briefly refer to a few background factors. The first one, which is most important, capitalism is not just a collection of manufacturers and traders selling commodities for profit. It is first and foremost a collection of 160 independent states, sovereign states as they call them, each with its armed forces to protect the privileged class against its own working class and against other states. Secondly, not all conflicts result in war. Sometimes a powerful country will be able to exact terms from some weaker one merely by the threat of war without actually going to war. Thirdly, and this is very much overlooked, there are usually divided interests inside the capitalist class in each country. One of them, for example, I shall refer to later, is the conflicting interest between the export capitalists, the people who make profits by exporting commodities, and the import capitalists who are working in the opposite direction. Each of them, of course, trying to influence the government to swing government policy in their direction. Fourthly, trade conflicts are not only about markets, that is exports, they are equally about imports and how countries succeed in getting them. Lastly, on these introductory points, while sometimes all the capitalists are in favour of a particular war that their government is going to engage in, it can also happen that they are deeply divided, and occasions have even happened when the capitalists are almost unitedly opposed to the war that their government is going to commit them to. I now come to a seeming paradox about wars. I suppose everybody will agree that nearly all the people in all the 160 countries in the world, if they were asked, would say that they want peace, not war. Yet when their governments go to war, most of these people will be found supporting their government. Now, the question is, how does this come about? I have read a statement that says, and I quote, "It is people's fear and hatred that makes war possible." Well, of course, they've got the cart before the horse. When a government decides to go to war, it calls in all its resources of propaganda, usually backed by the political parties and the churches, to try to create fear and hatred among the population where they did not already exist. As I say, it isn't the fear and hatred that causes the war, it's the government going to war which deliberately creates fear and hatred. If the argument were really true, ask yourself a couple of questions. If human beings react violently against anybody who injures them, why don't the working class in all countries react violently against their exploiters whom they know? Why do they turn their fear and hatred, so to speak, against foreigners whom they in fact don't know? Secondly, the question arises that if it is human nature that seeks an outlet in war, why is it that about 90% of all the troops fighting in the two world wars have been conscripts? Why don't the people just rush forward into battle? Why does the government have to drag them in against their will to go and get slaughtered? There have been politicians who've used this argument. Benito Mussolini was one of them. He used to go around saying that it's people's violent passions that have to have an outlet in war. Well, Lowe the cartoonist did a quite telling cartoon on this. He showed a big hall with a packed audience and Mussolini bawling at them, "It's your violent passions that have to seek an outlet in war. War's your responsibility." But instead of Lowe showing the hall filled with excited Italians saying, "Yes, we want war, give us war," he got the hall filled with a lot of meek, frightened, passive-looking sheep. And this, of course, was the answer to Mussolini. But, of course, in the real world, the workers are sheepish to this extent, that when somebody like Mussolini comes along and tries to whip up support for a war, unfortunately, most of the workers allow themselves to be led astray by people like Mussolini. One thing you'll find about all the governments that go to war almost all of them will use the argument that their particular government and their particular country are peace-loving, and that it's the foreigners who are forcing war on them. As Shakespeare put it, and I quote, "This happy breed of men, the envy of less happier lands." All the governments will present their wars in this sort of picture. Now, how does British history stand up to this amiable picture of Britain's wars? I jotted down a list of all the countries with which Britain has been at war. I got to 23, and I'm sure there are some I've left out. There is, in fact, more than 23. And going through the list in alphabetical order, it starts with Afghanistan, America, Abyssinia, goes on to the Boer republics of South Africa, and then through China, India, and so on. And right at the end of the list, in the alphabetical order, you get Tibet and the Zulus. Now, I ask you, does it really sound sense that this peaceable lot of people living in the country where we happen to be have been surrounded all through their history by all these other countries filled with warlike people who keep on attacking the British way of life? I mean, the Afghans and the Zulus. What did they ever do to people living in London, for example? The answer is, of course, it's a piece of nonsense. But don't get it wrong. This is the picture of British capitalism's wars. But of course you get exactly the same picture if you look at the history of all the other countries. Their record is just the same. Now, capitalism is international, but capitalism does not unite the 160 nations, it divides them. And I start off with a quotation from Marx and Engels, who set the pattern for all of this. And I quote, "The bourgeoisie finds itself in constant battle at all times with the bourgeoisie of foreign countries." So why does capitalism cause conflict among all these people? Why is it true that the capitalist class in all countries are at all times in conflict with each other? We can start with the way all of these nations came into existence, and this also was dealt with by Marx and Engels in the Communist Manifesto. They called it political centralization, forcibly engineered by interested capitalist groups. And this is how Marx put it: in independent or but loosely connected provinces with separate interests, laws, governments and systems of taxation become lumped together into one nation with one government, one code of laws, one national class interest, one frontier and one customs tariff. That's how these nations were formed, all of them, all the 160. But this inevitably brings, as they're forming one of these nations, it inevitably brings them into conflict with their neighbours, because each of these groups trying to set up a nation, try to bring within their frontier a sufficiently large population, sufficient means to produce food and other things that they'll want for their industry, and also all of them trying to get an easily defended frontier, which of course all their neighbours are trying to do the same and come into conflict with them. There is always conflict about this, and very frequently wars. Look at the history, for example, in the 19th century, the wars that Italy was involved in the unification of Italy, or when Prussia unified Germany. They also had a series of wars with other people, as Denmark and Austria and so on, to set it up. Or look, in our own day, at India. Look at the formation of India, Pakistan and Bangladesh, with violent and bloody wars in the process of setting up these different countries. And you can see the same conflicts going on now. You can see the Basque provinces of Spain fighting to get their independence from Spain. And you can see the Tamils in Ceylon, the Kurds at war with all the surrounding countries, because there are Kurds scattered over 4 or 5 different countries in the Middle East. You've got Kashmir fighting the Indians over it, and the national independence movements in Russia. You also had a few years ago the attempt by the French-speaking Canadians in Quebec to break away from the Canadian Federation, and the Sikh movement in India trying to set up an independent Sikh state against the wishes of the India where at present they are. And as soon as these nations are formed, the conflicts continue. The groups that have set up every one of these nations establish a class social system with the class relations of capitalism. They are all of them committed to the production of commodities, that is, goods produced for sale to produce a profit. They all have a price system, they all have a wage system, they all have conflict between the employers and the wage earners. They have a working class working for wages or salaries and not owning either the means of production and distribution, the land, the mines, the means of transport and so on, which are owned, of course, by the employers, the employing class, either by an individual capitalist, a company, or in many instances by the government itself. The working class produce the wealth, they don't own the means of production, and they don't own the products of their labour. And in all countries, you get inequalities of wealth. You may remember that soon after the Bolsheviks got power in Russia, Lenin put forward his plan for everybody in Russia to be paid the same wage, or they were all to come down to the level of the ordinary worker's wage. Well, of course, you can't run capitalism like that. It was dropped after a year, and Lenin had the grace at the time not to say that it was a step backwards, implying, of course, that they would resume their progress forward. Well, that was about 70 years ago, and of course I haven't the slightest intention to go to revert to anything like that. As regards the inequality of ownership in this country, it was dealt with a few years ago by the Royal Commission on the Distribution of Income and Wealth. And in their report they found this about the total accumulated wealth of this country, that the richest 1% of the adult population own 25% of it, about a quarter. That the top 5%, the richest 5% of the adult population, own half the total accumulated wealth, and the top 20th, that's 1 in 5 of the adult population, own 85% of the accumulated wealth of this country, leaving the poorest 80%, the great majority of the population, with only 15% of the total. Now, it is to protect this privileged class position that the armed forces are set up, both to protect the property owners against their own working class and, of course, against foreign capitalists. The government in each nation then has to tackle its problem. All governments have to see to it that their population are more or less adequately fed, and they therefore need food supplies. They need raw materials, they need sources of energy, coal or oil or something like that, and in order that industry can carry on. And to the extent that these things are not available within their own frontiers, although they would try to make them so at the beginning, they have to get them either by trade or by other means. Other means, frequently meaning forcible ones, by going to war. And of course, when their industry is established, they are also looking for markets for its products. All of these are causes of conflict and sometimes, of course, of wars. At this point, there are people who will say, well, yes, that's fine, that's a description of America, Britain, France and Germany and so on, but what about the socialist countries in the world? Well, of course, there are no socialist countries in the world. There are some countries that choose to call themselves socialist, but in all of them, they have got these features of capitalism. They have all of them got commodity production. They've all of them got inequalities of wealth and income. They've all of them got a wage and salary earning working class that don't own the means of production and distribution and don't own the products. And of course, they have all of them got armed forces to protect this situation. I now want to get out of the way some fallacious economic theories about the cause of war. I may say that none of these theories are Marxist. The simplest one is this. There are people who say that the capitalists have to export what they do export because there is no purchasing power available in the home market to buy those goods, so they've got to send them abroad and try to get somebody to buy them outside this country. Well, it's easily answered. Last year, British capitalism exported goods to the total of £78,000 million. And this theory asks us to believe that the British capitalists had to send this 78,000 million pounds abroad because there was nobody inside this country able to buy it. Well, it raises the question, who was it who bought the 85,000 million pounds of imports? Who brought all these imports into this country, and what do they do with them? How did they find anybody to buy them? The answer is, of course, quite nonsense. It comes up against the second problem, this. Since, according to this theory, every country lacks purchasing power, to whom were these 78,000 million pounds of British exports sold? Because, by definition, all the other 159 countries in the world themselves have no purchasing power and therefore can't buy it. They're all of them, in other words, exporting stuff, trying to sell it abroad, with nobody to buy it abroad, because they can't find people to buy it at home. There's also one other aspect of it. America and Russia only export 10% of their total production. Britain exports about 30%, and that's 3 times as much. And there are some other countries that export considerably more than 30%. Well, is it to be supposed that America, for example, with its vastly greater total production than Britain, is less affected by this alleged shortage of purchasing power in the home market? Obviously, it wouldn't make sense. Now, there are several varieties of this particular theory, which I won't go into. Some of them are rather complicated, but there is one of them that is worth going into for a very particular reason. It was the economist J.M. Keynes who put it forward in his book, The General Theory, published in 1936. Incidentally, although the Tory party, the Labour Party and the Liberal Party, ever since 1944, or at least right up to the 1970s, were committed Keynesians, and Keynes put forward in his book this theory about the economic cause of war, and it follows logically from Keynesian theory. I've never heard of a single Tory, Labour or Liberal politician refer to it, and it seems rather odd. I can only suggest a rather feeble explanation. It happens to be in the last chapter of the book, and they never got that far. They decided to work on the earlier chapters. But anyway, this is the theory. Keynes said that the chief economic cause of war is this deficit of purchasing power in the home market caused by government financial policy. And he said that if the government adopted the right financial policy, this cause of wars would be removed. And what he had in mind particularly was unemployment. What he was saying was that if the government had the right policy, the unemployed would all be earning wages instead of being on the dole, and also that all the workers would be getting higher wages, so the whole working class would have a lot more purchasing power, and that then they would be able to buy all the goods that are produced in this country, and the capitalists would no longer be under any pressure to have to export things, because Keynes says it's the pressure of having to export things abroad that brings the capitalists into conflict and is the economic cause of war. Well, first answer to it is, of course, that the whole Keynesian theory is a piece of nonsense. Governments cannot create jobs by any kind of government policy, no matter what it is. No government has ever created jobs. No government has ever abolished unemployment. Now, it is quite true that, as Marx pointed out, capitalism goes through a continual cycle. It goes through an expanding cycle when a very large number of the workers are employed. It runs into a crisis and then moves into a depression, and in the depression unemployment leaps to peak levels as it has at the present time. That goes on and governments can do nothing whatever about it, and no government has ever succeeded in doing anything about it. So from a practical point of view, the Keynesian argument about abolishing war just has no basis. Incidentally, Keynes met Roosevelt when Roosevelt was introducing the New Deal in America in the 1930s, and Roosevelt applied a Keynesian policy in America, just the policy that Keynes said the government should introduce. Well, 6 years after Roosevelt came into power in America, unemployment in America was 19%. Those were the official figures, which, as you will realize, is very much higher than it is in this country at the present time. Well, if after 6 years of Keynesian New Dealism, unemployment is still at 19%, it does suggest that the Keynesian idea is wrong, as of course it is. The final answer to all of these theories about that kind of economic cause of war is that under capitalism there is not and never can be any deficiency of purchasing power. The combined incomes of the capitalists, the self-employed and the workers are always sufficient to buy all of the goods that are on sale in the market, if they wanted to do so. But you've got to notice that what this term means. Purchasing power means power to purchase. If you've got money, of course, you've got the power to purchase something. But as Marx pointed out, although the capitalists have got power to purchase something, they may choose not to purchase it. Marx was following up an argument put by a French economist, J.B. Say. J.B. Say had made a famous statement that every seller brings a buyer to market. Say says, look, every capitalist who sold some goods in the market has got money, he can rush straight out away and buy some more goods, and the man to whom he's bought them has now got money, he can do the same, and you therefore have industry practically bound to be busy all the time. Marx pointed out, although the capitalist who has sold goods and got money could go straight out and buy some more commodities, he may choose not to do so. And Marx said, if enough capitalists choose not to do so, if the time gap between the sale and the purchase is too great, you get a crisis and its following depression. I'm not going into this more at the moment, except to point out that the reason why at certain stages the capitalists who have got the power to purchase don't go out and buy the commodities in the market is that they can't see any profit in it. I've used here before the example of the General Electric company of this country. When the crisis, the depression began in 1979, General Electric had 1,500 million cash mountain. In other words, they had sold their commodities, they had collected the cash, but they were not going out spending their money to buy more materials to produce more electrical goods of their kind. They chose not to do so. They chose to lend the money to the government and the banks and so on. Now, they could have done so at any time, which incidentally, by the way, answers those people who mistakenly say that if only the banks would lend industry more money, the industry would get busy again and unemployment would disappear. Here you've got General Electric. They weren't asking the banks to lend them money. They were lending money to the banks. And Marx pointed this out 100 years ago, the fallacious argument they use. So you can say this about the present 3.5 million unemployed. If and when enough British capitalists find that they can make a profit out of employing unemployed workers, they'll employ them. But it won't happen until then, and there's nothing that governments can do one way or the other to influence it. It just takes its own course. Now, next point, I said at the beginning that the pressure to import is just as great as the pressure to export. The J.M. Keynes, the man I've already dealt with, failed to see this because he was preoccupied all the time with this purely imaginary shortage of purchasing power in the home market. But if a country lacks supplies of essential goods such as food or oil or other things like this, it has to import them and it has to pay for them with export. So you see, initially the pressure on a government in this situation is the pressure to import to try to get hold of the resources it needs and pay for them eventually with exports. But if it can't get hold of them by trade, it gets hold of them, of course, by force, by going to war, by colonizing and this sort of things. Now, putting the thing the right way round, it was Marx's colleague Frederick Engels who pointed out years ago that it was the search for gold that led the Portuguese to Africa, and it was not exports to India, but imports from India that led to the conquest of India by the Portuguese, the Dutch and the English. As he ended up by saying, and I quote, "Nobody dreamt of exporting anything there. The exports came later." Now the second thing is to notice, the point I already made at the beginning, that the capitalist class are always divided about most issues, about things like inflation and deflation and interest rates. And one of the things they're always disagreed about is this conflict of interest between the exporters and the importers. The import capitalists, for example, want the foreign exchange rate of the pound to be high. The import capitalists, those are the people, say, who are importing goods from America or Italy or France and selling them in Britain, want the pound exchange rate to be high. Now, let me explain it like this. Suppose you start with the pound at the exchange rate that £1 equals $1. And suppose it changed so that the pound became equal to $2. Then the British importers importing goods from America would then be buying their goods twice as cheaply as they were before. They'd only be paying half the price in the American market. Very good for them if the pound exchange rate went up. But it would be devastating for the export capitalists. Again, if the pound exchange rate went up from being equal to $1 to being equal to $2, the unfortunate British exporters would now find that they couldn't sell their stuff because the American buyer would now be having to pay twice as much for the same quantity of British exports. Now, the policy of the Thatcher government, as you will know, for several years has been in the direction of keeping the pound exchange rate high. She repeatedly makes speeches about it. She's led a delegation of European countries to Reagan a couple of years ago, urging Reagan to take steps to help them to keep the pound high. And every fall in the pound is greeted by quite a lot of the newspapers as, you know, a very sad thing and all the rest of it. Now, I'm not suggesting that Thatcher's only motive about keeping the pound high was to help the import capitalists, the people who are importing goods to sell them in the British market. But nevertheless, of course, it has been exceedingly good for them. Only a week ago, the Bank of England announced that on the orders of the government, they have raised a loan of $4,000 million. In other words, they borrowed dollars, and they're going to use it to buy pounds, in other words, to press the pound up to prevent it falling. And as I say, this is not good for British export capitalists. 2 years ago, the Confederation of British Industry, which claims to represent all or the bulk of the manufacturers in this country, held a conference, and the executive of the Confederation of British Industry took the export capitalist point of view. They wanted the pound exchange rate to be brought down. So they put down on the agenda of the conference a resolution calling on the government to lower the exchange rate of the pound to help the export industries. Unfortunately for the executive, the delegates of the conference turned it down flatly. And it's taken 2 years for the Confederation of British Industries to carry on more propaganda, and they've recently reversed that decision, and they're now asking the government to lower the foreign exchange rate of the pound, which the Thatcher government, of course, doesn't want to do because it happens to take the opposite view. But here you get the sort of conflict between different sections of the capitalist class in each country. But now, what is interesting about this division of interest among the capitalists also applies to wars. After the French Revolution and Napoleon got power in France, wars went on, I don't know, for about 12 years or something like this between Britain and France and some other countries. And de Gibbons, in his Industrial History of England, comments on it. I won't quote at length, but de Gibbons said it was the merchants and factory owners in this country that wanted the war with America. And he wanted a war with France. And he says that it was in fact, and I quote, he said it was the merchants and manufacturers who forced Prime Minister Pitt into taking action, in other words, to go to war. Now, 50 years or so later in the Crimean War, you've got a very different situation. The Crimean War between Britain and Russia was nominally about the holy places in Jerusalem. Well, the British factory owners and merchants couldn't care less about the holy places in Jerusalem, but they couldn't see that it had any relationship whatever to their profit-making activities. And all the historians agreed that the British capitalist class were almost solidly opposed to going into the Crimean War. But the politicians, the government, took a very different view. The politicians took the view that they had constantly to take action against Russia to prevent Russia moving south and so on, because they took it for granted that the Russian expansionist view was to get hold of India and endanger the British hold on India. So you've got the government going to the Crimean War on this long-term view of holding Russia in check, and the merchants and manufacturers in this country taking a very different view of the whole matter. Russia, among other things, wanted to break up Turkey, and this, of course, would mean that the Russians would have got control of the Dardanelles and out of the Dardanelles into the Mediterranean, and this would was an aim that the British ruling class, for the sake of their empire, didn't want, although the merchants and manufacturers couldn't see it. Or take the Boer War, the war between Britain and the two small farmer republics in South Africa about 1900. It was very unpopular with a large section of the capitalist class, and Lloyd George, leading the Liberals, conducted violent campaigns against participation in the war. Or the First World War in 1914. When that war situation was developing, at least half the cabinet in this country were opposed to participation in the war. A number of them, by the way, were Quakers and near-Quakers, and had for years been preaching peace and so on, and they could see no reason why Britain should get involved in the war. What actually happened was, you got Churchill,